America's godly heritage dates back hundreds of years. Here on Martha's Vineyard off the coast of Massachusetts, a tent revival began in 1835 and lasted for decades. The camp meetings became so popular that in 1879 island residents built a permanent structure, the Tabernacle at Oak Bluffs, to replace the tents. At the height of this revival, one camp meeting drew 30,000 people to this small island community. Today, our nation is a much different place. For the most part, Americans ignore the rich godly heritage. This week on In Touch, I've invited historian David Barton to share a special 4th of July message. David will share historical truth about how this great nation was founded on biblical principles. I trust that today's program will help you understand how important it is for this and every country to bless and honor God.
We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal.
It is an honor to be with you this morning, and we really have a remarkably blessed history in America. I'm going to share some of that with you this morning, and let me kind of say up front that we've been very blessed in our organization, Wall Builders. We have about 100,000 documents that predate 1812, so I'm going to show you some of those really old documents this morning, but we've got thousands of documents of those who signed the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution, and documents from black history and constitutional history and church history and military, you name it. And it's a lot of fun to go back and look at that. And so what I want to do this morning and kind of turn in that direction is just remind us that this is really the time of the year when we start to celebrate. But it's also a time when we specifically celebrate what it was that 56 individuals did when they gave us the Declaration of Independence. That declaration is literally the foundation of our government. That is the foundation on which they later erected the Constitution of the United States. And to this day, we continue to hold the Declaration as our foundational document. Right below the Declaration, it holds the Declaration up. Article 7 of the Constitution brings the Constitution right on top of that Declaration. So both documents go together. So when you look at what we have with our form of government that we celebrate every year on our birthday, the 4th of July, it has produced what is now known as American exceptionalism. Now, that term is a term that we don't use much in schools anymore, but it's a term that we used in previous generations. It was a term that was actually introduced back in the 1830s by a man named Alexis de Tocqueville. You may recall Alexis de Tocqueville because he's the guy who did the famous book Democracy in America. What he did was he came to America from 1831 to 1835, traveled across the nation. He was from Europe, he was from France. He said, you know what those Americans are doing is really special. It's really different. We've never seen any of that kind of stuff here in Europe. Why are they so different? And so he went for 4 years and went all over the nation looking to see what made us different. Went back, and for Europeans and for Frenchmen, he wrote the book to say, here's what's different about America. Here's why they are what they are. And after having looked closely at this nation for 4 years, this is what he said back in the 1830s. He talked about what we call American exceptionalism. He said, the position of the Americans is quite exceptional, and it may be believed that no democratic people will ever be placed in a similar one. We were only 50 years old. He said, man, when I look at what those Americans are doing, it's exceptional. I don't think any other nation will ever do what they've done. So that term American exceptionalism has proven to be an accurate term. As a matter of fact, if you look at where we are today in America, we've had one form of government. That declaration, we've had one form of government. And if you look at other nations in the world, it's been quite different. Same period of time, we've had one form of government. France has had 15 different governments just in the same period of time. If you look even at just the 20th century, Afghanistan had 5 different constitutions in the 20th century. Poland's had 7 since 1921. You've had Russia with 4 since 1917. And you can go through the other nations as well. If you look at the United Nations this year, there's 192 nations at the UN. And that number goes up and down every year. Depends on who conquers whom and who revolts from who and who starts their own nation. 192 nations this year. America is the only nation in the world that does not average a revolution every 30 to 40 years. And we kind of take it for granted. We just assume that stability is natural, and stability is not natural. As a matter of fact, Jesus told us there should be wars and rumors of wars. It was that way when He left. It'll be that way till He gets back. That's normal. What America's experienced is not normal. Now, when you look at this exceptional position we've been placed in, suddenly in America in the last few decades there's been this move that, Europe is the older, experienced nation. They've been there for a lot longer than America. Why don't we kind of be like sophisticated Europe? And what they do with government's pretty good, and what they do with civil rights is real good, and what they do with health care is real good. And there's this movement to be kind of like Europe. And we're even seeing it at the U.S. Supreme Court, where Supreme Court justices are quoting what Europe does instead of what America does. Let's be like Europe. Let's do what they do with their laws. 200 years ago, there was the same kind of intellectual elite movement that was going in America that said, hey, let's be like Europe. And at that point in time, Thomas Jefferson addressed that movement. I thought he made a statement that still is applicable today. Thomas Jefferson said this. He said, the comparisons of our government with those of Europe are like a comparison of heaven and hell. Yeah, why would we give up the stability and the prosperity and the exceptionalness that we... And by the way, this is not a comment on American pride. This has nothing to do... We're not blessed in America because we have a 4-syllable word with an A on each end. We've been blessed in America because we've adopted certain principles that God was able to bless across that time. See, that's what we knew made us different from other nations even back then. Andrew Jackson, President of the United States, put his finger on it when he said this. He said, the Bible is the rock on which our republic rests. That's what made us different from other nations. That's why God's been able to bless us in ways that other nations... It's not that God's a respecter of persons. He's not a respecter of nations. Any nation that will use His principles, God will bless. Any person that will use His principles, God will bless that. It's real simple. But America has done that across the years. It's just that we seem to have forgotten that in our own history. So when you look at this exceptionalism that we've enjoyed today, if we say, well, who are the people responsible for American success? Who are the people who gave us this independence that we now enjoy? Today, if you look in our textbooks, you'll find that, well, we credit people like George Washington, and we'll credit people like Thomas Jefferson, and we'll say, John Hancock is certainly one of the leaders. That big, bold signature on the Declaration of Independence is the President of Congress, and we'll say John Adams. And by the way, the cool thing about John Adams is we're kind of rediscovering who he was. David McCullough's book, and now TV specials, miniseries that have been out there. We're kind of rediscovering some of our founding fathers. And these are the folks that we would say, these are the ones responsible for American independence. And that's okay because they are significant. But what I really find intriguing is when you go back into their writings 200 years ago and you let them talk about who the leaders were, you get a whole different set of names. As a matter of fact, in 1816, John Adams, 40 years after the American Revolution, looking back on it, we're now an established nation. He said, the people that we look to, the people that we can point to and say they're responsible for American independence, they included people like the Reverend Dr. Samuel Cooper, the Reverend Dr. Jonathan Mayhew. Of course, you had the Reverend George Whitefield. Oh, and there's the Reverend Charles Chauncey. He went through and listed all these preachers. Now, we don't hear this in any textbooks today. And we might know who Whitefield is, but the chances that we know anything about Cooper or Mayhew, Chauncey, slim to none. Not only do we not study these preachers, we don't study the black preachers who had such an impact in the American founding. We know very little about folks like Richard Allen or Absalom Jones or John Moran or Lemuel Haynes. The huge impact that preachers had in the American founding, black and white, we don't study that today. And while we're on things we don't study, we do know about Paul Revere, the Midnight Ride of Paul Revere, the famous poem Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, that ride that Revere... Revere was not the only one riding. As a matter of fact, there was another guy riding at that time. His name was Wentworth Cheswell. Wentworth Cheswell was a black patriot. He was elected to office in New Hampshire in 1768. He was a leader in his church. He was reelected in New Hampshire for the next 45 years, held about 9 different political offices in New Hampshire. Well, we didn't know that blacks and whites were both riding, giving the alarm that night. Absolutely. You see, there's so much about American history we don't hear. What we'll usually hear is the negative aspects, and sometimes we say, particularly in civil rights, we get a Southern view of civil rights. We don't get the other view that was often out there. There are so many patriots we don't hear about today, in addition to folks folks like Wentworth Cheswell. If you go 6 weeks later over to when we had the Battle of Bunker Hill, you know, the hero of Bunker Hill is right there in the painting. We just don't talk about it anymore. But his name is Peter Salem. Peter Salem right there, and right beside him is David Grosvenor, black and white, fighting side by side in the American Revolution. But Peter Salem is the one who got all the special honors and awards and commendations. More than a dozen different awards from the National Congress, from the State Congress, from his military leaders. I mean, he was the hero. He saved countless American lives that day, but we've never even heard of Peter Salem today. In the same way, we'll see the picture of George Washington crossing the Delaware, but we wouldn't recognize folks like Prince Whipple and Oliver Cromwell, two black patriots who served throughout the American Revolution with the general and the general staff throughout the Revolution. Never even heard of those guys. And then if you even move to the last battle of the American Revolution, the Battle of Yorktown, certainly we're going to hear about the young General Marquis de Lafayette, but we don't talk about the other guy standing there right in the painting with him, and that's James Armistead. James Armistead is the hero of Yorktown. He's the first double spy we had in the American Revolution. It's because of what he did that we were able to trap the British, cut months off the Revolution, save countless scores of lives. James Armistead, hero. We just haven't heard these guys before. So there's so much of our history we don't hear, and I don't say this lightly. I've been appointed by a number of state boards of education in several states to help write the history and government standard for students in those states.